Lecture 4 on Module 4, Genre. Now let's talk about the recipe for comedy. Again, I will start us off with a quote. Comedy is tragedy plus time. Steve Allen. Okay, so we're going to look at those same elements for our ingredients, right? Characters, language, plot direction, plot resolution, empathy. But instead of magnitude, we're going to talk about something called the comic premise. Starting with characters. How are characters in comedy different from characters in tragedy? Well, oftentimes the biggest difference is the socioeconomic status of the protagonist. The protagonist in a comedy tends to be a regular person or even an underdog, not an extraordinary person who's kind of at the center of the, social power structure. Think about like Lindsay Lohan's character in Mean Girls. She doesn't fit in. Or Anna Kendrick's character in Pitch Perfect, right? She doesn't fit in. She's got to fight her way in there. And generally speaking, characters within a comedy are going to be less complicated, less complex, less deep than their counterparts in a tragedy. Characters in tragedy tend to be very psychologically complex. We kind of really learn a whole lot about their inner workings, and they're deep thinkers, and they wrestle with things. Characters in comedies are a little bit shallower. And so they're kind of more sketchily drawn. Characters in a comedy are going to exhibit a few really strong personality traits, and they're going to act and react predictably based on these types. You've seen this. You know how a Rachel is going to react versus a Monica or a Phoebe in Friends, because they are relatively simply drawn characters. And so in a comedy, the focus is going to be on society at a whole, or at least a piece of society, as opposed to this kind of like monomaniacal focus on the protagonist. You can see how this kind of plays out even in like titles. You think about movies like Mean Girls or Clerks or Crazy Rich Asians, as opposed to Hamlet or Antigone or Julius Caesar, right? The titles in comedies are often going to be about groups or cliques or sections of society, not single people. And usually, what's going on in a comedy is this contrast between the social order and the individual protagonist. So I like to think of it as there's kind of either a quote crazy person in a normal world, right? And I don't mean crazy by any sort of psychological, mental illness, which is not funny, but I just mean like a misfit, someone that doesn't quite get it, someone that doesn't quite fit in, someone that is odd compared to everybody else, right? So we've either got a normal person, or excuse me, we've either got a crazy person in a normal world, or we have a quote normal person in a crazy world. And with a comedy, we witness this inversion of typical social power structures. What do I mean by that? Goodness, that sounds very, very heavy. What I mean is that by the end of a comedy, the powerful are often humbled, but they're not exiled necessarily like characters in a tragedy. They're still often part of the community, but they've kind of been brought down a peg or two. And the outcasts or the underdogs become the winners. Let's think about how language in a comedy is going to be different than language in a tragedy. More often than not, language in a comedy, even ancient comedies, even comedies by the Greeks, even comedies by Shakespeare, it's going to be in prose. Sometimes in verse. There are like some really awesome French comedies by Moliere from the 1600s where people speak in rhymed couplets. So it's sort of like every two lines rhyme. It's sort of like reading Dr. Seuss out loud. But for the most part, comedies are going to be in regular, ordinary language. But it's not just regular, ordinary language, right? A good playwright is going to include kind of lots of witty dialogue and banter and wordplay. And, we see that a lot in sitcoms even today. Even things like, Archer on Adult Swim there or Bob's Burgers, right? There's a lot of contrast and there's a lot of dialogue that makes things funny and jokey. So there's craftsmanship. And so we call these things some things that we can use. We can use puns, where we're kind of joking on the different meanings of words. We can use repartee, which is really almost like a tennis match of words between two characters. If you're fans of the old TV show The West Wing, there's a lot of that there. Sometimes they use malaprops, which is a character who is trying to come off as smarter and more sophisticated than they are. They use like really big fancy words, but they say it wrong. When I was a kid, I had a good friend in like kindergarten and first grade, and she came home from school one day and told her mom, she's like, "Yeah, in school today we learned all about orgasms," and her mother was absolutely horrified. And what my friend was trying to say was organisms. Malaprop. Funny, haha. All right, plot direction in comedy. How is it different from tragedy? Well, if we go and sit down at a play and we open our playbill and we see that it's a comedy, we kind of immediately breathe a sigh of relief. We know from the start that probably everything is going to turn out okay. But also in a comedy, we're going to see some pretty ridiculous situations. But usually those ridiculous situations are not life or death scenarios. It's much more regular stuff. But events can snowball and can quickly go from something very small to the biggest embarrassment ever or potential catastrophe. So think back to that video from the Three Valentines, right? The guy trying to get the spot on his pants and how quickly things snowballed out of his control and just went to big looming disaster, right? It's not a tragedy because it's not a life or death situation that his pants are burned and he got a paper cut on his finger, right? But it's still kind of that catastrophic thing that's happening. So, but because we have this sense that everything is going to turn out okay, and because these situations are ridiculous, there tends to be this kind of low level of threat to characters in a comedy that is definitely opposite of what we see going on in a tragedy. Another thing that happens is like characters in a tragedy, right? I was saying they really wrestle with these ethical, thorny issues and then they make a wrong decision at a critical moment. Characters in a comedy can be relied upon to make the wrong decision over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. And they're not even wrestling with a thorny ethical issue when they make these decisions. Usually they're trying to ignore any thorny ethical issues and they're just going to make the selfish or the expedient choice, not the ethical choice. Another thing that's really key to the plots of a comedy is that we have something called the suspension of natural laws. Let's unpack that a little bit. If you've ever seen a Roadrunner cartoon, you know exactly what we're talking about, even if you've never heard this phrase before, right? As we can see in this picture, Coyote was chasing the Roadrunner. He ran right off the edge of the cliff. He's going to stand there in midair, ignoring the laws of gravity until the Roadrunner will kind of like point out to him that he's floating in midair, in which case the Coyote will look to the camera, kind of blink at us, and then fall to the ground, get smushed into a crater, and then kind of like walk like an accordion or something. If this were real life, there's a whole lot of things that would go differently, but obviously the thing that would happen would be the Coyote would be dead. In Roadrunner cartoons, the Coyote is always okay, embarrassed, humiliated, and hungry, but still okay. So the natural laws of gravity, of physics, of biology don't work in this comedy. And we see suspension of natural laws of all kinds in comedy. So sometimes it's a law of physics, but it's really like characters are able to get away with things in a comedy that in real life would get them in serious trouble and have major consequences. Things don't seem to have the same consequences in a comedy than they do in real life. And so sometimes the suspension of natural laws are like the laws of society. Think about any romantic comedy. The way characters behave in romantic comedies most of the time would get you arrested with a restraining order today. So I don't even know why we watch them, right? Because they're really not good templates of how to model our own behavior, right? But we know it's a comedy, so we kind of forgive. We kind of know, right, that willing suspension of disbelief comes in here, and we're going to let these characters get away with things that they couldn't do in real life. Let's turn now to the plot resolution in a comedy. As I've said before, we kind of know from the beginning the characters are going to come out okay. In a traditional comedy, the play always ended in a wedding. Usually the plot was all about two characters that were in love that couldn't get together for reasons. They work it out by the climax, and so the play ends in a wedding. Modern comedies were not so tied to that plot device, although there are plenty that do end in weddings, or at least the promise of a wedding. But if we're not doing a wedding, comedy is going to end with a feast or a dance or a ritual celebration of some kind that's kind of life affirming and community affirming, and everything is awesome. So let's take all of these things together. We've got predictable, kind of shallow characters in ridiculous situations with a suspension of natural laws and a sense of everything that will be okay. The emotional impact on an audience is going to result in relatively low empathy. With low empathy, or greater aesthetic distance, if you want to phrase it that way, that keeps us safe. We're not going to worry too much about these characters as they're making these disastrous decisions. And so because we're not worried about them, we're allowed to think a little bit more critically about the characters or the plot or the theme. And so what would be painful or frightening or serious in real life, you can laugh at in a comedy. All right, you know me and my word nerdiness. It's time for us to introduce another German word, Schadenfreude, taking pleasure in somebody else's pain. Sometimes our empathy is so low in a comedy that we really kind of derive pleasure at the character's pain or distress. This does not make us monsters as long as we're aware of it, okay? Because we're in this safe environment. We have told ourselves from the beginning, this is not real. Everyone's going to be okay. It's all right. So it's okay to laugh at them. I hope things that we laugh at in a comedy, we would not laugh at in real life, because in real life, we would engage in more empathy, right? So I think now maybe part of our issue as a society is because we tend to avoid the tragedies and really steer ourselves towards the comedies. We're really kind of letting that empathy muscle atrophy, and we're a little bit too much Schadenfreude. But if you think of it like dessert, then it's okay every now and then. One other thing to talk about with comedy is this thing called the comic premise. So the comic premise, it's an idea or a concept that turns kind of the accepted notion of things upside down. It's the one thing or the biggest thing that's different between our own objective observable reality and the reality of the world of the comic play or movie. This is where that Truman Show movie clip comes in handy. So think about comic premise as you watch the Truman Show clip. And so this comic premise becomes the basis on the comedy of the play. It's going to involve exaggeration and incongruity and contradictions, right? So incongruity is something that's illogical or an out of the place surprise. If you were a little kid that watched Sesame Street, do you remember the kind of little clips where they would sing that song like one of these things is not like the other, right? And there would be four different shapes and three of them would be the same and one thing would be different. That's kind of the incongruity, the comic premise. And I like to think of comic premise as the reality of a play and a comedy. It's like the universe just next door to ours. Most of the details are the same, but there's this one twist that's like, oh, that's weird. So let me give you some examples. What if you're sick and tired of war, so you lead an anti-war protest by creating a nationwide sex strike? That is the comic premise of the Greek tragedy Lysistrata. Or what if you were the star of a reality TV show, but you had no idea? That's the comic premise of the Truman Show. More recently, what if you went to meet your boyfriend's parents and you discovered that they were one of the wealthiest families in the world? Comic premise of Crazy Rich Asians. So can you see how the comedy is going to come out of this little twist on reality? Because it's kind of setting things off center. So here's summing up our recipe. We've got a quote regular person or an underdog in a ridiculous situation. We've got a twist on reality, our comic premise. We have the suspension of natural laws. Our regular person character and the other characters around them are going to make expedient choices because these characters are rather simply drawn and predictable. Probably going to have a fast pace here. So we're going to have low empathy, but we're going to have a kind of catharsis through laughter. And play is going to be written in prose for the most part, but it might still be witty. Now we have a comedy.